chapel master director of the chamber music at the court of Anhalt-Köthen. My father was court and field trumpeter at Weissenfels, and my brother was a trumpeter at Anhalt-Zerbst, where it sometimes sung at discretion with the chapel. And I was soon engaged as a singer to the prince at the court of Anhalt-Köthen. His wife had died a year before, and from the marriage 3 sons and a daughter were alive: Katharina, Dorothea, Wilhelm Friedemann, Karl Philipp Emanuel, and Johann Gottfried Bernhard. For Friedemann, the father had started a little clavier book in which after various practice pieces came further pieces which were soon made into 2 particular works for the profit of musical youth desirous of learning. He soon started a little clavier book for me as well. He had a gracious prince who both loved and knew music, with whom he also intended to end his lifetime. But it had to happen that the Serene Highness should marry a princess von Bernburg, and it would now take on the appearance as if his musical inclination was becoming rather cool, all the more as the new princess seemed to be an amusa. So God disposed that he should be called to Leipzig as director of music and cantor at the Thomas School, although at first it didn't seem at all proper to him for a chapel master to become a cantor. Therefore this resolution dragged on for a quarter of a year. Ever since his youth he had been moved by a particularly strong desire to hear as many good organists as possible, so that from Lüneburg, when he was still at school, he often went on foot to Hamburg. And he was, when barely 18 years old, called as organist of the new church in Arnstadt. From there he once made, and indeed on foot, a journey to Lübeck to hear the famous organist of that place, Mr. Dietrich Buxtehude. He was then called as organist at the church of St. Blasius in Mühlhausen, and very soon as organist to the court of Weimar, where his gracious lord's pleasure at his playing had inflamed him to try everything possible in the art of handling the organ. He knew also thoroughly the construction of organs and had once been invited by the University of Leipzig to examine the new large organ of the St. Paul's Church. But as cantor he had no duties as organist. He was the most senior teacher at the Thomas School after the rector and the vice-rector, and since the school provided the music for 4 churches in the town as well as for weddings and burials, he had to apply all possible care so that the boys, who were capable of singing and could accomplish something in music, were well instructed in this. To the new church and to St. Peter's Church came the boys who had nothing to sing other than motets and chorales. And to the 2 principal churches, St. Thomas and St. Nicholas, those who had to do with other concert music. He had the supervision of the organist and of the town pipers and the violinist who had to work here with the boys, and he had to provide concert music for the divine service every Sunday except the last 3 Sundays of Advent and the Sundays of Lent. Christmas, Easter and Pentecost were celebrated with concert music for 3 days, and for these great feasts the music performed in the morning service at one church was performed again in the afternoon during Vespers at the other church. The same for New Year, the feasts of Epiphany, Ascension, Trinity, St. John, St. Michael and the Reformation, as well as for the 3 feasts of Mary and the renewal of the town council. There too he had to provide the Passion music for Vespers on Good Friday. Also the Kyrie and Gloria and the Sanctus were occasionally concerted, and the Latin Magnificat at Christmas. Of our first 3 children, death robbed us soon of Christiane Sophie Henrietta, the firstborn, and Christian Gottlieb, the second son. I had a new little clavier book which Sebastian had started for me with 2 new suites. And for the Michaelmas fair of the following year, he had such a suite engraved in copper as the first partita of the clavier practice. It was the first composition that he had printed. He then published such a partita every year up to 5, which he had printed together with the 6 as Opus 1.
Geschlossener Sommerszeit zur Freiheit werde bahnen. Ich geb euch Macht, Abend bis zum Morgen, vom Mittag bis zur Mitternacht, wieder zu raten. Blumenblätter fliegen mit Kälte, Frost und Schnee, entsetzlich anzublasen. Gib euch Macht, die Seelen umzuschmeißen, die Himmel aufzureißen. Gib euch Macht, die ungestümen Meeresflut, eure Nachdruck zu erhöhen, dass das Gestirne wird selbst der Fels nicht sicher steht, wenn selbst der Fels nicht sicher steht. Und wenn die Rechte
He was soon charged by the students with music for many extraordinary university celebrations, and a further few years later he received the direction of the Collegium Musicum which Mr. Telemann had founded in Leipzig. But when the student Mr. von Kirchbach charged him with funeral music for the deceased Queen Christiane Eberhardine, the organist of St. Nicholas, Mr. Görner, who had the direction of the new divine service at the university church, protested to the university, and the university would permit Sebastian to perform his music only as a pure favor. A year later the prince died in Köthen, and as former court singer I helped make the funeral music there, composed and performed by the former chapel master. And 3 weeks later he performed in Leipzig his Passion music after the evangelist Matthew during Vespers on Good Friday at St. Thomas for the first time.
tut dieser Kanzler nicht allein nichts, sondern will sich auch diesmal nicht erklären. Die Singstunden nicht und es kommen auch andere Beschwerden dazu. Änderung wird nötig sein. Es muss doch einmal bringen.
Es ist ja notorisch, dass meine Herren Präantecessoren Schell und Kuhnau sich schon der Beihilfe derer Herren Studiosoren bedienen müssen, wenn sie eine vollständige und wohllautende Musik haben produzieren wollen, welche sie dann auch insoweit haben prestieren können, da sowohl einige Vokalisten als Bassist und Tenorist, ja auch Altist, als auch Instrumentisten, besonders 2 Violisten, von eurem hochedlen und hochweisen Rat aparte sind mit Stipendiis begnadiget, mithin zur Verstärkung derer Kirchenmusiken animiert worden. Da nun aber der jetzige Status Musicis ganz anders wie der ehedem beschaffen, die Kunst sehr viel gestiegen, der Gusto sich verwundernswürdig geändert, dahero auch die ehemalige Art von Musik unseren Ohren nicht mehr klingen will und man umso mehr einer erklecklichen Beihilfe benötigt ist, damit solche Subjekte choisiert und bestellt werden können, so den jetzigen musikalischen Gustum assequieren, die neuen Arten der Musik bestreiten, mithin imstande sein können, dem Kompositori und dessen Arbeit Satisfaktion zu geben, hat man die wenigen Beneficia, so eher hätten sollen vermehrt als verringert werden, dem Coro Musico gar entzogen. Es ist ohnedem etwas Wunderliches, da man von denen deutschen Musicis prätendiert, sie sollen kapabel sein, allerhand Arten von Musik, sie kommen nun aus Italien oder Frankreich, England oder Polen, sofort extempore zu musizieren, wie es etwa diejenigen Virtuosen, vor die es gesetzt ist, und welche es lange vorher studiert, ja fast auswendig können, über dem auch Gott notandum in schweren Solde stehen, deren Mühe und Fleiß mithin reichlich belohnet wird, prestieren können. Man solches doch nicht konsiderieren will, sondern lässt sie ihrer eigenen Sorge über, da denn mancher vor Sorgen der Nahrung nicht dahin denken kann, sich zu perfektionieren, noch weniger zu distinguieren. Mit einem Exempel diesen Satz zu erweisen, darf man nur nach Dresden gehen und sehen, wie da selbst von königlicher Majestät die Musici salariert werden. Es kann nicht fehlen, da denen Musicis die Sorge der Nahrung benommen wird, der Chagrin nachbleibet, auch über dem jede Person nur ein einziges Instrument zu exkolieren hat, es muss was Treffliches und Exzellentes zu hören sein.
He had then written to a friend of his youth who had meanwhile become Imperial Russian agent at Danzig.
Here, by God's will, I am still settled. But since now, 1. I find this service by far not so considerable as it was described to me. 2. Many accidental fees of this station have gone. 3. A very expensive place. And 4. The authorities strange and little devoted to music, so that I have to live amid almost constant vexation, envy and persecution, and consequently, with the Almighty's help, I shall have to seek my fortune elsewhere. Should your honour know of or find a suitable position in that region for an old and faithful servant, then I beseech him most obediently to put in a very gracious recommendation for me. I should not fail to devote myself to the best of my ability to give satisfaction to this most gracious intervention and intercession. My present position amounts to about 700 thalers, and when there are somewhat more corpses than ordinarily, the accidental fees augment proportionally. But when the air is healthy, then on the other hand these diminish, as last year when there was a loss of more than 100 thalers from the ordinary accidental fees from corpses. In Thüringen I can go further with 400 thalers than in this place with as many hundreds again, on account of the excessively high cost of living.
He had many friends in Dresden and often went there with Friedemann. Friedemann was soon called there as organist at the church of St. Sophia, where his father had some time before given a concert on the organ. He was also invited to Kassel to examine and to inaugurate in a public gathering the renovated organ of the large church, and he took me with him on this journey. We had just lost our 1.5-year-old Christiane Dorothea, and soon death robbed us also of our 4-year-old Regine Johanna and little Johann August Abraham, 2 days after his birth. That year the prince had died at Dresden, and Sebastian with the deepest devotion dedicated to the new elector a grand missa consisting of Kyrie and Gloria.
For some years until now, I have had the direction of the music of both principal churches in Leipzig, but have, withal faultlessly, had to suffer one offence or other, and also from time to time a diminishing of the fees pertaining to this function. All of which would, however, quite disappear if your Royal Highness would render me the grace of conferring on me the title of Your Highness Court Chapel, and to this end would send to the proper place a royal order for the publication of a decree. Such an extreme gracious granting of my most humble prayer would pledge me to infinite devotion, and I offer myself in a most indebted obedience to show my untiring diligence in composing church music as well as for orchestra, at all times at your Royal Highness' most gracious desire, and to dedicate my entire strength to your service.
And in the following month he gave several dramata per musica and cantatas in honor of the princely house. And when the prince with his wife then blessed the town of Leipzig with their most august presence, the students wanted, on the day on which His Majesty had 1 year before been chosen King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, to show their most humble devotion through an evening music. Christmas the same year he gave a grand oratorio in 6 parts, and a further oratorio for the following Ascension.
Und jetzt hat er meinem ersten Präfekten Kittler unter Androhung harter Strafen befohlen, mit dem anderen Chore zu gehen, und lässt mir durch diesen Krausen davon Nachricht geben, welchen er mir so zum Präfekten des ersteren Chores mit Gewalt aufzwingen will. Es ist höchst unbillig, ich mag solches nicht geschehen lassen, zumal die musikalischen Kirchenstücke so im ersteren Chore gemacht werden und meistens von meiner Komposition sind, ungleich schwerer und intrikater sind weder die, so im anderen Chore musiziert werden. Ich bitte Sie gehorsamst um Schutz und Hilfe. Unter dem Schutz des Herrn Superintendenten.
Ich Ich habe mich beim Herrn Superintendenten erkundigt, er hat Ihnen keine Verordnung gegeben. Ich habe ihm die ganze Sache erzählt. Er probierte meine Konduite gänzlich und ließ sich gefallen, dass es bis zu der Wiederkunft des Herrn Vorstehers und nach ausgemachter Sache bei der von mir auf Befehl des Herrn Vorstehers gemachten Anordnung bliebe, weil es doch billiger sei, dass der Kantor dem Herrn Vorsteher und dem Rektor als diese jenem ad interim nachgäben.
Ich kehre mich daran durchaus nicht. Es mag kosten, was es will.
Then the rector let it be known to all pupils that, under punishment of dismissal and castigation, no one was to permit himself either to sing or to direct the habitual motet in Krause's place. So that in the afternoon sermon, to Sebastian's greatest despect and prostitution, not one pupil for fear of the punishment would take it upon himself to sing, even less to direct the motet. That week Sebastian had the supervision of the school.
Augen warten auf dich, Herr, und du gibst ihnen ihre Speise zu seiner Zeit. Du tust deine Hand auf und sättigest alles, was lebt, mit Wohlgefallen. Vater unser, der du bist im Himmel, geheiligt werde dein Name, zukomme dein Reich, dein Wille geschehe, als im Himmel auch auf Erden. Unser täglich Brot gib uns heute und verlasse uns unsere Schuld, als wir verlassen unseren Schuldigern. Und führe uns nicht in Versuchung, sondern erlöse uns vom Übel. Amen.
Hitler, warum wart ihr Nachmittage nicht mit dem ersteren Chore?
Der Herr Rektor...
Hinaus. Setzt euch.
He looked to the council for very soon and prompt help. In vain, he could not get rid of Krause. But that year the king bestowed upon him through Count Kaiserling the title of court composer. 3 days later he gave a grand concert on the new organ of the Church of Our Lady in Dresden, in the presence of the count and other excellencies and many members of the court chapel, artists and other persons, who heard him with particular admiration. And he was then able, after Krause's stay at the school had come to an end, since he had also written in vain to the consistory, to beseech the king with the most deep humility to order the council to support and protect the cantor in his right to nominate the choir prefects without interference, and to order the consistory to demand an apology from the rector for the affront made to the cantor, and then also by a particular measure to charge the superintendent to exhort the entire school, so that all the schoolboys should show the cantor the appropriate respect and obedience. And the king called upon the consistory in writing to act duly on the cantor's grievances, and the consistory asked for a report from the superintendent and from the council within a fortnight.
Er heißt auch Bassus continuus oder nach der italienischen Endung Basso continuo, weil er kontinuierlich fortspielt, da mittels die anderen Stimmen dann und wann pausieren, wiewohl auch heutzutage dieser Bass zum öfteren Pausieren sonderlich in künstlich gesetzten Sachen. Von der Definition. Der Generalbass ist das vollkommenste Fundament der Musik, welcher mit beiden Händen gespielt wird, dergestalt, dass die linke Hand die vorgeschriebenen Noten spielt, die rechte aber Kon- und Dissonantien dazugreift. Damit dieses eine wohlklingende Harmonie gebe zur Ehre Gottes und zulässiger Ergötzung des Gemüts. Und soll wie aller Musik, also auch des Generalbasses, Finis und Endursache, anders nicht, als nur zu Gottes Ehre und Rekreation des Gemüts sein. Wo dieses nicht in Acht genommen wird, da ist keine eigentliche Musik, sondern nur teuflisches Geplär und Geleier.
All his pupils were afterwards able to render service usefully to God and the Republic, and he sought to effect everything to help promote the welfare of his children. Friedemann was called from Dresden to Halle as music director and organist at the Church of Our Lady, a post which his father had once attained. Emanuel lived for some time as a student in Frankfurt on the Oder, at the same time he informed the clavier, and he soon became chapel musician and accompanist to the King of Prussia. And Bernhard, when barely 20 years old, was called as organist at St. Mary's Church in Mühlhausen. But after Bernhard had been not 2 years in Mühlhausen, his father had to pay not only for his table there, but also a bill of exchange, which had presumably caused his removal then, and also to leave a few ducats for the settlement of some debts. And after he had then helped him to be promoted to Sangerhausen, in the hope that the more civilized manner of life in Sangerhausen and the genteel patrons would equally stir the misled son to other behavior, the father had to learn yet again with the utmost dismay that Bernhard had once more borrowed from here and there, that he had not changed his way of life in the slightest, but had even absented himself without letting him know the slightest part of his whereabouts. Since no admonition or even any loving care and assistance would suffice any more, the father had to bear his cross in patience, merely leaving the undutiful son to the mercy of God, not doubting it would hear his sorrowful plea, and finally, according to the divine will, effect that he should learn to acknowledge how conversion is to be attributed solely and uniquely to the divine good. But Bernhard died suddenly in Jena, where he was matriculated as a student of law and lived with Mr. Johann Nikolaus Bach, eldest of all the Bachs still living, organist of the university as well as the town church. That year Sebastian published the third part of the clavier practice, consisting in diverse preludes on the catechism and other hymns for the organ. The second part, consisting in a concerto after the Italian taste and an overture after the French manner for a clavicembal with 2 manuals, he had printed 4 years earlier. Our dear and good cousin Mr. Johann Elias Bach, well-established cantor at Schweinfurt, lived with us during those years. He was matriculated at the University of Leipzig as a student of theology and at the same time received furtherance in music from Sebastian. And Sebastian had entrusted him with the instruction of my 3 sons, Gottfried Heinrich, Johann Christoph Friedrich and Johann Christian. And our cousin also had to prepare them for the Lord's table. For me, he had written several times to his dear mother and sister that she should send me a few plants of yellow carnations, because I was a great amateur of gardening. And since Sebastian once reported to me that he had seen a linnet at a cantor's house in Halle, which through the skilled instruction of its teacher did particularly well in singing, our cousin had written to Halle to beg this cantor to let me have his singer for a cheap payment. And once, since I suddenly felt very unwell while Sebastian was in Berlin visiting Emmanuel, and it was not known whether the violent agitation of the blood would give rise to an insidious fever or some other evil consequence, our cousin had to write to Sebastian several times and disturb him in his peace and contentment, so that he might quicken his journey. A short time after his return, he had, as a new clavier practice, an aria with 30 variations for clavicembal with 2 manuals composed by him on a saraband from my little clavier book, engraved in copper. Count Kaiserling, who was ambassador to His Imperial Russian Majesty at the court of Dresden, had expressed to Sebastian that he would like to have a few clavier pieces for his harpsichordist who had to play something for him during his sleepless nights. And since Sebastian had composed these variations for this, the Count had made him a present of a golden goblet, which was filled with 100 louis d'or.
Selbstmord des Konrektors. Hat sich ihm den Zwinger sogleich hinter der Pastorwohnung an dem Wagnerian Garten an einer Krause gehangen und ein Ende genommen mit Schrecken.
Mein Gott, wann kommt das schöne Nu, da ich in Frieden fahren werde und in dem Sande kühler Erde und dort bei dir im Schoße ruh, der Abschied ist gemacht. Fällt gute Nacht.
In the last years he performed some of his earlier church pieces again.
Ich freue mich auf meinen Tod. Ich freue
Emanuel now already had a male heir who was born at about the time when we, alas, had the Prussian invasion. Thereupon Sebastian once again made the journey to Berlin, accompanied by Friedemann. And since His Majesty the King of Prussia had asked several times why he didn't come one day, he went to Potsdam. His Majesty himself played him a theme for a fugue which he at once to His Majesty's particular pleasure developed on the clavier. On the following day, before many listeners, he performed to the general applause on the organ of the Church of the Holy Spirit. And in the evening His Majesty wanted to hear a fugue with 6 obligatory voices, which he also accomplished at once, to the amazement of the King and all musicians present. Emanuel also showed him the new opera house in Berlin and the large dining hall in it. And he found that the architect had done here a masterstroke, namely, if someone above in one corner whispered a few words very quietly towards the wall, another standing diagonally opposite in the other corner heard it quite clearly, and otherwise in the middle or in the remaining places not one of the other persons heard the slightest sound. He had soon noticed in Potsdam that through want of necessary preparation his performance would not succeed as the theme given to him by His Majesty demanded, and he had therefore taken the decision and at once made bold to elaborate this truly royal theme more completely and then to make it known to the world. And after his return he committed to paper a 3-part Ricercar and a 6-part, and a trio for flute, violin and clavier together with a few other little pieces of art on the royal theme, had these pieces engraved in copper and dedicated them to the king as a musical offering. He had now entered the Society of Musical Sciences founded in Leipzig by his pupil Mitzler, and also had engraved in copper a few canonic variations for the organ which he had furnished on his entry into this society.
Papa, es ist ein Fässler Most aus Schweinfurt gekommen, ein Geschenk von Herrn Vetter Elias.
The distance between our two towns did not allow us to pay each other a personal visit. Else Sebastian wanted to take the liberty of officially inviting our cousin from Schweinfurt to the wedding of our daughter Liesken to the new organist of Naunburg, Mr. Altnicol, which was to take place in January. But since the inconvenient time of year also would not allow our cousin to be seen personally among us, Sebastian still asked him to assist the children in his absence with a Christian wish. Our three youngest, Regine, Susanna, Johanna, Carolina and Johann Christian, were still staying at home, together with Sebastian's daughter Katharina Dorothea, unmarried. And our eldest son, Gottfried Heinrich, whose genius also inclined towards music but was not developed. Our 18-year-old Johann Christoph Friedrich entered the Count of Schaumburg-Lippe's chapel at Bückeburg a few weeks before Sebastian's death. To the Missa which he had dedicated to King August, Sebastian had now composed a grand credo. He added an earlier Sanctus, and also wrote an Hosanna, Benedictus, Agnus Dei and Dona Nobis Pacem to it. He had also started a new collection of grand chorales for the organ, and had been working for some time on an art of the fugue through which is shown what can possibly be made out of a theme. But he could only prepare one part for engraving, and at the end the grand fugue was interrupted through the illness of his eyes. He wanted to remove this eye illness through an operation, but it had to be repeated and failed, so that for 4 months thereafter he was almost always ill and could not use his sight. In his blindness he dictated a chorale for the organ on the melody When We Are in Greatest Need, and then had it written down with a few more corrections under the title Before Thy Throne I Tread, which is sung to the same melody. And suddenly his eyes seemed to get better, so that one day in the morning he could see quite well again and could also support the light again. Only a few hours later he was overtaken by a high fever in which, despite all possible care of 2 of the most skilled doctors in Leipzig, he died one evening softly and blessedly.